I'm sort of making fun of myself with the title of the show, which is Too Much Film School. I have too much film school, and I hope that you don't waste as much time as I did going to film school.
Well, it certainly filters down very nicely. I'm a big fan of all your analyses and all the stuff you've been putting up on there. Specifically, you do have some really interesting content on the film we're talking about this week, which is very, I suppose, topical or relevant given the time of year. And that is, of course, John Carpenter's 1978 film Halloween. That's what we're going to be chatting about today. When was the first time you saw Halloween, by the way? Do you remember?
I do. I very specifically remember I was in high school. It was in the mid 90s. I don't want to say exactly how old I am, but um, I had seen, I was not a big horror movie fan when I was a kid. I didn't grow up with like older siblings who made me watch it and like
Mm,
traumatize me and stuff.
yeah.
But when I got to high school, there was a girl who was really into the movie Scream.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, well, I gotta watch this movie to like, get in with this girl. I don't remember her name anymore. It was a long time ago, but I do remember seeing Scream. And I remember it was the first time that I sort of thought about how movies were made. I mean,
Hmm.
I wasn't a moron, like I knew that movies were made, but like I didn't know anything about it. And
Mm.
Scream made me think about it in part because of all of their like references to everything. And
Yeah.
this is very early internet. And there were fan websites that collated all of the references in Scream.
Mm.
And of course, the most important one in Scream is Halloween.
Yeah.
The I shouldn't say one of the characters is named Loomis in Scream, named after the doctor in Halloween, who himself is named after the boyfriend in Psycho. And that's sort of my first inkling of how filmmakers build off of one another.
Hmm.
And in fact, the essay that I wrote that got me into film school
Hmm.
was about the connections between Psycho to Halloween to Scream.
Yeah.
So Halloween was sort of like the second in a chain
Well, it
of
was the meat and
films
the
that got me
sandwich
to
there.
where I am.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It was the meat and the sandwich there with Psycho and Scream as the bread. So it's the
Yeah, I mean, I think all three of those are kind of very important turning points
mm,
in the horror genre.
mm,
Um, uh, it it's because before so Psycho is definitely a predecessor, and there were other movies that you could sort of now categorize as slasher films before Halloween, like
hmm.
Texas Chainsaw or maybe
We've
the
got things like Friday the 13th and
well Friday
I
the
suppose.
13th comes after. There
Oh,
was a
sorry,
Canadian
before.
movie. Yeah,
Oh, well, there's
there
like
was a
what is
Canadian
Black
movie
Christmas
slightly before
before?
Halloween. What's that?
Is Black Christmas before Halloween?
Black Christmas, that's the one. Black Christmas was a Canadian movie, and it didn't do very well in America. And some Canadian scholars sort of argue that that's more important than Halloween
Mm,
as like sort of kicking off the trend. But honestly, because Black Christmas was not as popular, it didn't do as much. But
mm,
uh, Halloween was hugely successful, and there's an interesting feature in filmmaking that if you study the course of there's another Too Much Film School video about this
mm,
about film cycles where when one movie is hugely successful, you'll see people try and copy it, but there's usually like a delay. So
mm.
when Halloween comes out in 1978, it was biggest independent movie of all time, I think, at that point, or very close to it. In 1979, there were no movies. There were no what we would call slasher movies where there's a guy with a knife stalking teenagers or anything like that. 1980, suddenly there's a dozen of them, including the sequel to Halloween because they wanted
Hmm.
to cash in
Hmm.
on it. And then for the next few years,
Yeah.
there's two, three dozen of them. And the biggest one is Friday the 13th
Yeah.
because once Halloween is big, Friday the 13th is even bigger. Now everybody's like, oh, we can just get seven or eight young actors that
Teenagers
nobody's ever heard
and
of, put them in a
yeah.
room together and stab them. Now we have a movie. And it worked for 3 or 4 years. And then the whole market crashed, which is again a normal thing. In horror movies in particular, their cycles tend to be shorter because they're not very expensive films.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people rush in, make a bunch of the same kind of movie, the audience gets sick of it, and then the box office goes down, they move on to the next thing.
Mm,
So in 1983, there's like three slasher movies. And it
mm,
seems like if you were alive at the time, which I was, but I was a child, it seems like that trend sort of died. And then in 1984, Nightmare on Elm Street comes out.
Yeah.
And it was like nothing anybody had ever seen because it was very abstract and dreamlike. And also, suddenly, instead of a guy with a mask, it was a guy who talked a lot, which is Freddy
Mm.
Krueger. And he made fun of the victims and all that stuff. And it was very creative. And then a news cycle happened immediately after that, where it was still slashers, but they were now supernatural ones.
Mm.
They're coming back for that. And what happened with both Halloween and Friday the 13th, both of them, Jason and Freddy, were just guys
Mm.
for the first couple of movies.
Yeah.
After Freddy comes out, Jason comes back to life, and Michael is suddenly they decide he's part of like a cult or
Yes.
something.
Yes.
It's a whole crazy thing. If you watch the whole series, it's bonkers. Um,
That's really interesting
but
though.
that is why it's the fact that those two cycles happen sort of back to back.
Mm.
Prior to 1978, when you said a horror movie, people generally thought of like Dracula and Frankenstein
Yeah.
and like castles and stuff like that. After the 80s, even though there's a wide variety of horror movies, there's psychological thrillers and ghost movies and all kinds of things. If you just say horror movie generically, a large chunk of the audience actually thinks of slasher movies specifically, of a
Mm.
guy with a mask killing teenagers. And
Mm.
it's because of Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street all in such a short span of time, it shifted our perception of the whole genre for decades now, and we still
Mm.
we still think of it that way. So
Mm.
Halloween became, even though, like you said, it was sort of the sandwich between Scream and Psycho, it was a turning point in the way we viewed horror movies.
Mm.
Um,
And it's
so it's
interesting.
it, it's very pivotal.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well that the character or the person who's in the middle of these slasher films, sort of, if you want to think about it, relative to how many years that have passed since, it had quite a rapid change in what you say with people like Freddy Krueger becoming kind of supernatural and Michael Myers himself becoming quite supernatural. But you've made the point that the characterization of Michael Myers, at least in 1978, for what that was at that time, and remains to be quite a significant characterization in a horror movie or in a piece of cinema. Can we talk about that characterization and what makes it so unique?
Yeah, it was a different kind of approach in the way that John Carpenter primarily wanted to remove as much as possible out of the character. He said it was inspired by I think it was The Strangers. It was
Oh, the
um
innocence?
The Innocents, not The Strangers, sorry. The generic The blank is
Yeah.
I got it mixed up. You're right. It was The Innocents. He liked the idea. It was a ghost story, and he liked the idea of how the ghosts don't actually do anything. They just sort
Mm,
of stand there and stare at the main characters and the audience. And he wanted to see like how little Michael Myers could do while still making the movie scary.
mm,
So a lot of the movie is us sort of trying to read into what he's doing, and it's almost like putting our own interpretation onto him, because he gives us nothing. Like, even at the most basic level, as a director talking with the actor, um, the actor who played Michael would sometimes ask John Carpenter, "Hey, like, what's my motivation for whatever?" And John Carpenter says, there is no motivation. You walk
mm,
from here to here. That is it. Don't get excited. Don't get sad. Don't like, get angry. Like, nothing. And so the less there is of him, the more there is for us to sort of put something there, but there
mm,
is nothing there. And that's
mm,
kind of the point. And so any interpretation you have of Michael is, on the one hand, perfectly valid because there's nothing to negate it. But on the other hand, it's all you. It's all you as an
mm.
audience member deciding what is the thing that made him the way that he is, as opposed to him giving us a whole backstory and stuff, which, like, the uh, Rob Zombie remake, the
Yeah.
first half of that remake is giving us a whole backstory, and we kind of know who Michael is, which, I don't know. Some people like that, and there's something to be said for that, but it is not what John Carpenter wanted to do.
Yeah.
John
Yeah.
Carpenter wanted it to be the purest kind of evil, which is to say there is no reason for it. It's just evil.
Mm,
And I think that it, that's why like the mask is white. You
mm.
know, that's
Blank
that's why he
canvas.
wears a mask at all. So you can never see his expression.
It's like when
It
you go
just
into those
is. Like
costume
the symbol
shops,
is there.
you know, when you go into those costume shops and they have like the mask and you can like paint, you can like, here's all the
Right,
paints that
right.
you can use. And when you get it fresh, it's just straight wide. It's almost like if you never used the paints, if we never colored on him any motivations or anything like that, it is just the straight blank canvas mask in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you were to paint anything, people would assume, oh, the red represents,
Yeah.
passion or whatever, and things like that. So if you get rid of everything,
Mm.
this what's left is simply the evil, which is what he wanted to do. And it was very effective, but it also meant everybody who made a sequel didn't kind of know what else to do
Yeah.
with it. So in the second one, they made him Laurie's sister, so suddenly he had a motivation, and then and that's what happened in the mid '90s. The H2O, where he's chasing cross country to get his sister, and the remake and all of that stuff. It's sort of like, well, what do you do if he's just nothing? And so they always kept adding stuff on top of them. And then the more recent reboots, the 2018 one, they tried to go back to him simply being nothing. And I think they did a fairly good job of that. And instead of focusing on him, they focused on the Jamie Lee Curtis character, Laurie, who I think while Michael was super influential, like Jason is basically Michael at a summer camp
Mm.
in
Mm.
the Friday the 13th films. It's a different mask, but roughly the same.
Yeah, because that
He's
one's
a big
wide as
guy and he
well.
stabs people.
That's wide as well, that one.
Yeah, it is the hockey mask is very white.
Mm.
Um, but Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie Strode, she was a very specific kind of teenage girl in the first movie,
Hmm.
and it's something that I think all of those knockoffs in the mid '80s that I was talking about, they don't generally do a very good job of writing the victim characters.
Yeah.
You like Laurie Strode and you like her friends, and you're sort of, I shouldn't even say sort of, you're sad and disappointed when they get killed. You kind of want them to get away. Whereas there's other kinds of slasher movies where it's like a meat grinder and their characters are annoying and you want them to get, knocked off. And I think that's something besides all of the everybody remembers the scary direction and the creepy Michael Myers and stuff with Halloween, but I think part of the reason why it stands out is the main character, Laurie, Jamie Lee Curtis.
Mm.
I think that's why that movie made her a star. She had been in a couple of movies before that, and her parents were famous, of course. But that movie made her a star because of how real that character was. And I think the reason why that character, why Laurie is as interesting as she is because John Carpenter didn't write her by himself. He had a co-writer,
Hmm.
Deborah Hill, who also produced the movie, and I don't think John Carpenter, as a guy in his mid 20s, fresh out of film school, would write a teenage girl very well. And he let most of the dialogue go to Deborah Hill. And she said that she essentially wrote it like her and her friends. She was a babysitter,
Hmm.
like she had done. Like if you remove Michael from the movie, it's just teenage girls getting up to shenanigans with their boyfriends, and one of them is too shy to talk to a boy. That kind of normal things that a teenager can relate to. And
Mm.
I think Deborah Hill's contribution to that is why we're still talking about
Yeah.
Halloween and we're not really talking about Friday the 13th. We talk about Friday the 13th as a series when we talk about Jason as like a force, but we don't particularly care about the final girl from the first Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
do, I think, still care about Jamie Lee Curtis, which is why I think the best of the Halloween sequels are the ones where they bring Jamie Lee Curtis back. The Halloween 20 years later is very good, and the 2018 one, which is it's either the second, the third, or the 11th Halloween movie, depending on what you're counting. But it's because they brought Jamie Lee Curtis back and they dealt with her and like her character's trauma
Mm.
more than they dealt with Michael. And I think that's why that movie felt like the first one
Yeah.
again.
Well, going back
Is
to
it
what
was
she
it was
was,
about Jamie Lee Curtis and her family, and also this unstoppable force coming to destroy them,
mm,
as opposed to let's just throw a bunch of unlikable characters together and let Mike stab them.
yeah. So I want to focus on sort of her specific characterization in the 1978 version, because you make this interesting point about a lot of people kind of misinterpret the film as kind of this moralistic tale around, warning people about, not engaging in debaucherous or indulgent activity. But you make a perceptive point about, well, it's not that she doesn't necessarily invite those things into her life. We see scenes of her smoking a joint, and she does contemplate the idea of getting with that Tramer fellow. Can you talk a little bit about what sets her apart from the other characters and why there is some kind of symbolic significance in her being the one that lasts till the end versus some of the other characters?
Well, I think what you're talking about is actually the intersection of the two sort of key filmmakers, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill,
Mm,
in that Jamie Lee's character is much more looking out into the world and less sort of self-centered. I think some of the other couple of her friends are sort of less interested in the world and more interested in their own sort of personal doings. And Lori is interested in kind of everything. And so she is a good sort of bookworm, and she is a good babysitter. She's friendly with the kids, whereas her friend Annie is trying to push the girl out so she can get with her boyfriend. But it's not the issue is not sex, I don't think. To me, the issue seems to be much more about being open to being open and paying attention to other people and not being selfish and self-centered the way that her friends are. And it's I think it's overly simplified to say it's just anti-sex. And in part, like you said, it's not like Laurie Strode wasn't trying
mm,
to get with a boy. She just was too shy to do it. So it doesn't really line up very well. And again, this is where the knockoffs and the innumerable sequels get it wrong. Is they 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 looked at the most sort of superficial interpretation of it, and so they just made it about anytime two people made out, then
mm,
the bad guy would come and kill them,
mm,
and that wasn't nearly as interesting as a character who's a little bit more mature and is looking to be both active socially but also be a maternal figure to the little ones. And that was a much more interesting character who is worth rooting for in a way that
yeah.
often there isn't. And because of that, the John Carpenter, the director, along with Dean Cundy, the cinematographer, the way they use the camera with Laurie and with everybody else, they make it clear in the filmmaking that Laurie is seeing things that other people aren't seeing.
Mm,
And it's very basic, cinema language where, you see Laurie looking at something and then you cut to her point of view, and then you cut back to her looking, and her friend who's standing next to her is not looking. So that's why she sees Michael and why her friend doesn't. And on a very simple level, like as a scary movie, the music, kicks up a notch and all of that stuff. And it works very well. It is effective because you're like, what's that guy? And then what is he
mm,
going to do? And then he doesn't do anything. And it builds up tension. But it also makes us understand that she's different from everybody else. Even the doctor who thinks he knows what's going on with Michael Myers, Dr. Loomis, the one whose name is used over and over again in all of
mm,
these movies, he never actually sees Michael until the very end of the movie.
mm,
He keeps looking for him, and there's a really funny shot that the irony of it is I don't think I even appreciated it when I saw it as a teenager, but later on I was like, oh, that's hilarious. Where he's talking to the sheriff, and he's like, this horrible guy is coming, he's going to murder everybody, and he looks around and he looks from right to left, and as he does it, the car that Michael is driving passes by behind him,
oh,
and he is looking the wrong way the entire time. And
yeah.
this is 1978. Like they had to have a guy in a walkie-talkie say, "Okay, start now
Yeah.
and turn your hand here at this speed." And it probably you couldn't like fix it in post or anything. It would have been
Mm,
really obnoxious. I know it's just as a filmmaker, it would have been a pain in the butt. They probably did like 7 takes to get the timing right,
yeah.
but it works so well
Yeah.
that the doctor doesn't see. and Laurie does. And so that's why like Laurie makes it all the way to the end, whereas her friends who aren't paying attention, who aren't looking for him, they get it, or he gets them, and
Mm.
it's it's sad and it's traumatizing for Laurie and all of that. But she's the one who sees him, and so she's the one who manages to not just save herself, but save the kids. And again, this is sort of an important distinguishing marker between her and all of the sort of knockoff characters. She's not selfish. She
Mm.
makes sure to save the children at
I think it's also
the risk of her
significant
own
though.
life.
Like I love that you've made the point in talking about it before as well that also the doctor looks at Michael, and that's without giving too much away for anyone that hasn't seen the film. Although we might, that has a
Uh,
significant effect on what happens in the film, and it's almost
yeah, I
like
mean,
I was just gonna say, I know we've talked before about how he's a sort of blank canvas kind of character, but if we think about some of the like really like indifferent or apathetic elements of our world and universe, I love that in talking about how when you've used the word you've referenced love like H.P. Lovecraft and kind of I feel like there is almost a bit of cosmic indifference about his character. It's almost in like in her facing that and in the doctor facing those things that are sort of embodied, maybe not intentionally, but they are reminiscent of those sorts of things in Michael, that they're able to actually overcome him, no matter, despite how scary he kind of is.
well, I think that's absolutely intentional. I think if you see interviews with Carpenter, he did talk about H.P. Lovecraft and the sort of unspeakable evils. And it is interesting when you think about those. Often in the Lovecraft books, it's sort of you've seen pictures where it's like the tentacle monster and it's as big as a
Mm.
planet and whatever, and it's sort of incomprehensible in that way. Obviously, in 1978, with no budget, Carpenter couldn't do that. But what he
Yeah,
could do was have to go in the opposite direction and make it so blank, it's
yeah,
still staring into the abyss and the abyss staring back at you. He did it and I think later on when he does make the thing and
yeah.
the mouth of madness, he's sort of trying to do a little bit more explicitly H.P. Lovecraft. But
That's really good for his
I
fans
think
to
that's
know
still
though,
in his
because
head.
there's so few like good film adaptations of Lovecraft's work. So it's good for people to know that they can check out Carpenter, in lieu of that, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think he does a better job of it than some of the more direct adaptations.
Or like
Although is
Color Out
Mouth
of
of Madness
Space and
actually an
things like that.
adaptation? I'm not,
Sorry, which
sorry.
one? I was going to say Color Out of
I said
Space
I
with
don't
Nick
know if
Cage.
Mouth of
Wasn't the film?
Madness is actually an adaptation or not. I
Oh,
know
okay.
it's heavily inspired,
Mm,
but yeah, he does even Christine, which is a Stephen King book. His version of it with the car is this monstrous, unspeakable force
mm.
that you can't quite understand. And Carpenter does that a lot. I think his version of the unspeakable monster is I think that sticks around. I think that's why he's one of the greatest. But again, I also think in particular to this film that we're talking about with Halloween, what makes Halloween different than all of them is it's got Michael on the one hand, but it's got Laurie on the other. And very few films, very few of the that category of horror films have the Laurie character. And I think Scream pulls it off. But other than outside of Scream, I don't know that anybody really does it in a memorable way.
Yeah.
Maybe It Follows.